He thought humiliating her would entertain the crowd, but he had no idea he was about to dismantle his own reputation in front of 500 people seated beneath crystal chandeliers. The grand hall of the Westbridge Symphony Theater shimmered under warm golden light, the polished mahogany stage reflecting every movement like a mirror designed for greatness. And yet, in the far corner near the velvet curtains, Lillian Hayes moved unnoticed, her quiet figure blending into the background as she wiped down the glossy surface of a Steinway grand piano worth more than most homes in the city. At 42, she carried herself with a calm, almost invisible grace, her dark hair tied back simply, her gray maintenance uniform unremarkable, the kind of presence people looked through rather than at. Around her, the evening's elite gathered in tailored suits and elegant gowns, their laughter soft but laced with expectation, all waiting for the performance of Alexander Wolf, a name that echoed through concert halls from New York to Los Angeles. A man known not only for his brilliance, but for his quiet disdain toward anyone he deemed unworthy of the stage. He stood near the wings now, adjusting his cufflinks, his sharp eyes scanning the room with practiced authority, already sensing something was off, because tonight, something had gone wrong. The headline performer scheduled before him had canceled at the last minute, leaving a gap that no one dared to fill, and the tension behind the curtains was thick enough to silence even the most confident staff. Assistants whispered urgently, managers checked their watches, and donors shifted impatiently in their seats, the hum of anticipation slowly turning into discomfort. Alexander exhaled sharply, irritation flickering across his face as he looked toward the stage, calculating, always calculating, because to him, the show was not just art. It was control, precision, reputation. And then, his gaze landed on her. Lillian, standing quietly beside the piano, cloth in hand, as if she belonged to the furniture more than the moment. For a second, his expression stilled, then something colder took its place, a thought forming, deliberate, and dangerous. He stepped forward, his polished shoes echoing softly against the marble floor as he approached, his presence alone enough to make nearby staff straighten instinctively. Lillian sensed him before she saw him, pausing mid-motion, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the piano as she turned her head just enough to acknowledge him, her eyes steady, unreadable. "You," he said, his voice low but carrying an edge that cut through the quiet backstage air. "You've been around this instrument long enough, haven't you?" There was a subtle shift in the room, a few staff members glancing over, sensing something unfolding, something uncomfortable. Lillian didn't answer immediately, only gave a small nod, respectful but distant, as if she understood more than she let on. Alexander's lips curved slightly, not into a smile, but into something closer to amusement, the kind that precedes a decision already made. Behind them, the murmur of the audience grew louder, restless now, and the stage manager hurried over, whispering about delays, about expectations, about the need to do something, anything, to keep the evening from slipping into embarrassment. Alexander raised a hand, silencing him without even looking, his attention still fixed on Lillian as if she were no longer just a background figure, but a solution. Or perhaps an opportunity. "Perfect," he murmured, almost to himself, before straightening and turning toward the stage, already envisioning how this would play out, already hearing the laughter, the relief, the distraction it would bring. Because in his mind, this was harmless. A brief spectacle, a moment of entertainment at someone else's expense. And as the lights dimmed slightly and the announcer's voice echoed across the hall, calling for an unexpected interlude, Alexander Wolf stepped aside, gesturing toward the stage with a calm, inviting motion that felt less like an invitation and more like a test no one expected her to pass. The room began to quiet, conversations fading into a soft hush as heads turned, eyes curious, waiting, and in that suspended moment between doubt and discovery, Lillian Hayes placed the cloth down slowly, her gaze lingering on the piano for just a second longer than necessary, as if greeting something familiar, something long forgotten, before she took her first step forward, the sound of her shoes against the wooden stage echoing far louder than it should have, and somewhere in the audience, a faint chuckle broke the silence, followed by another, and another, until the air itself seemed to lean toward mockery. unaware that it was about to be rewritten. The note did not fade the way a mistake would. It lingered with a clarity that settled into the room like something deliberate, something placed with intention rather than accident. And before anyone could fully process it, the second note followed, then a third, each one measured, controlled, forming a sequence that did not belong to uncertainty, but to memory. And Lillian Hayes remained still except for her hands, her fingers moving with a quiet precision that felt almost out of place against the expectations that had been built around her. And the audience, still leaning toward amusement just moments before, found themselves hesitating, their reactions caught somewhere between dismissal and curiosity, because what they were hearing did not match what they had been prepared to witness. In the wings, Alexander Wolf shifted his stance slightly, his arms still crossed, but his posture no longer as relaxed as it had been, his eyes narrowing just enough to signal attention rather than indifference, as if he were trying to identify something familiar hidden within those first few bars, something that did not align with the narrative he had constructed so confidently only seconds earlier. The melody began to take shape, not rushed, not exaggerated, but steady, unfolding with a quiet confidence that did not ask for approval, and Lillian's expression did not change, her gaze lowered toward the keys, her breathing even, as if the room, the audience, the man who had placed her there, none of it existed beyond the instrument in front of her, and somewhere in the middle rose a woman who had been whispering to her companion fell silent mid-sentence, her head tilting slightly as she listened more carefully, her earlier smile fading into something more attentive, more uncertain. The sound filled the hall gradually, not overpowering, but undeniable, each note connecting to the next with a fluidity that suggested not just practice, but understanding, and the polished walls that had reflected laughter moments ago now carried something else entirely, something that demanded stillness, and the subtle rustling of programs slowed, then stopped, as if the audience had collectively realized that continuing to move would somehow disrupt what was happening. Backstage, the assistant who had whispered earlier took a step closer to the curtain, his eyes fixed on Lillian, his expression no longer confused but focused, as if he were trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he thought he knew. And even the stage manager, who had been glancing nervously at his watch, now stood completely still, his attention drawn fully to the stage. The piece grew more complex without warning, the transitions sharper, the tempo shifting with a control that required not just familiarity but mastery. And a man seated near the front, someone who had attended concerts for decades, leaned forward slowly, his brows drawing together as recognition flickered across his face, not of the performer, but of the composition itself, because this was not a simple tune, not something someone would casually attempt under pressure. It was a demanding work, one that challenged even seasoned musicians, and yet Lillian's hands moved across the keys without hesitation, without visible strain, her fingers finding each note as though they had always known where to go. Alexander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, his gaze now fixed entirely on the stage, the faint trace of amusement gone, replaced by something far less comfortable, something closer to realization, though he had not yet allowed himself to fully accept it. And the audience, sensing the shift even if they could not name it, leaned further into the moment, their earlier assumptions dissolving quietly, one note at a time, until the only thing that remained was the sound itself, filling the space with a presence that no one had expected and no one could now ignore. By the time the melody reached its turning point, the room had already forgotten how to breathe normally. The air itself seemed to tighten around each note, as if the walls were listening just as intently as the audience. And Lillian Hayes remained composed at the center of it all, her shoulders relaxed, her movements controlled, her fingers gliding across the keys with a confidence that no longer needed to prove anything, because the proof was already unfolding in real time, undeniable and precise. And somewhere near the front row, a man who had once studied classical performance sat frozen, his program slipping slightly from his hand as recognition fully settled in, because the piece she was playing was not just difficult, it was infamous, a composition known among professionals for its technical demands and emotional depth, something that required years of disciplined mastery. And yet here she was, not struggling, not hesitating, but shaping it, bending it into something that felt alive. A hush fell deeper over the hall, not the polite silence of an audience waiting for entertainment, but the kind of silence that comes when people realize they are witnessing something they cannot explain, and the earlier laughter now felt distant, almost inappropriate, as if it belonged to a different moment entirely, and one by one, the expressions across the crowd shifted, smiles fading into concentration, curiosity giving way to awe, and even those who had not understood the complexity of the music could feel the difference, could sense that what they were hearing was not ordinary. Backstage, the assistant who had once questioned the situation now stood completely still, his eyes wide, his attention locked onto Lillian's hands as they moved faster, more intricate, each passage executed with clarity, and the stage manager slowly lowered the clipboard he had been gripping, no longer thinking about schedules or delays, because none of that mattered anymore. Not when the performance itself had taken control of the room. Alexander Wolf did not move, but something in his expression had changed entirely, the confidence that once defined his posture replaced by a growing tension he could not mask, his gaze fixed, unblinking, as the realization he had tried to ignore began to take shape with every measure she played. Because he knew this piece, he knew its structure, its traps, its demands, and more than that, he knew its history, a history tied to his own past in a way he had not expected to revisit, not here, not like this. Lillian transitioned seamlessly into the most demanding section, a passage known for breaking even the most skilled performers under pressure, and yet her tempo remained steady, her dynamics precise, her touch balanced between strength and restraint, and for the first time since she had taken the stage, someone in the audience leaned forward not out of curiosity, but out of respect, drawn in by something they could no longer dismiss. The music rose, layered, intricate, filling every corner of the hall, and the grand chandeliers above seemed almost to shimmer with it, reflecting a moment that no one had anticipated. And still, Lillian did not look up, did not acknowledge the shift around her, because she did not need to. The sound itself carried everything that needed to be said. And as the final movement approached, building quietly beneath the surface, there was a collective awareness that something irreversible had already happened, that the assumptions made only minutes ago had been dismantled piece by piece, and that the woman they had once overlooked was now holding the entire room in a silence so complete, so absolute, that no one dared to interrupt it, not even with a breath. The final movement did not announce itself with grandeur. It emerged quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a breath drawn before a truth no one was ready to hear, and Lillian Hayes guided it forward with a control so refined it no longer felt like performance. It felt inevitable, as if every note had been waiting for this exact moment to exist, and the hall, once filled with expectation and judgment, now held something entirely different, something closer to reverence, as the sound wrapped itself around every listener, leaving no space for doubt, no room for dismissal, only the undeniable presence of mastery unfolding in real time. Her fingers moved with a precision that no longer needed to prove itself, the complexity of the composition no longer visible as effort, but transformed into something fluid, something natural, and in that transformation, the audience understood what they had missed from the very beginning, not just her skill, but her history, the years that must have shaped such control, such depth, hidden behind a presence they had chosen not to see. Alexander Wolf felt it before he fully understood it, a tightening in his chest, a shift in the balance of the room that he had once commanded so effortlessly, and now, for the first time, he was no longer directing the moment, he was witnessing it, and that realization settled heavily as the music reached the passage he knew better than any other, the section he had once attempted years ago on this very stage. A piece that had defined his reputation not because he mastered it, but because he could not, because he had stepped away from it, leaving it unfinished, unresolved, a quiet omission in an otherwise celebrated career. And now, Lillian was not only playing it, she was completing it, shaping it with a clarity that left no room for hesitation, no trace of struggle, and the recognition struck him fully, unmistakably, as the final phrases unfolded with a confidence he had never achieved, each note placed with intention, each transition seamless, and the room felt it too. Even those who did not know the history sensed the weight of what was happening, the quiet dismantling of something that had once seemed untouchable. No one moved, no one whispered. The silence held firm as the final sequence approached, the tension building not from uncertainty, but from anticipation, because now they knew, now they understood that this was not a spectacle, not a moment of amusement, but something far more significant, something that demanded their full attention, their full respect. And then, with a final series of notes delivered with absolute control, Lillian brought the piece to its conclusion, not with excess, not with dramatics, but with a restraint that made it even more powerful, the last note resonating through the hall, lingering just long enough to remind everyone that what they had witnessed was real, before fading into a silence so complete it felt almost unreal. For a moment, no one reacted, as if the room itself needed time to catch up with what had just happened, and Alexander Wolf stood still, his expression no longer composed, no longer certain, but something else entirely, something that could not be hidden behind reputation or authority, because in that moment, all of it had been stripped away, leaving only the truth of what he had underestimated. And at the center of it all, Lillian Hayes simply lifted her hands from the keys, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if nothing extraordinary had taken place, as if the silence surrounding her was not the result of shock, but merely the natural ending to something that had always been within her, waiting for the right moment to be heard. The silence did not break immediately. It stretched, deep and unshaken, as if the entire hall was suspended between disbelief and understanding. And for a moment longer than anyone expected, no one dared to move, because applause would have felt too small, too simple for what had just taken place. And Lillian Hayes remained seated, her hands now resting gently in her lap, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, as if she had merely completed a routine task rather than something that had just rewritten the atmosphere of the entire evening. Then, somewhere in the back rows, a single pair of hands came together, a quiet, uncertain clap that echoed softly against the marble and wood, and it was followed by another, then another, until the hesitation gave way to recognition, and the room erupted, not into polite applause, but into something far more powerful, a standing ovation that rose in waves, filling the space with a sound that had been earned rather than expected. People stood without realizing they were doing it, drawn upward by something instinctive, something that acknowledged not just skill, but the humility and restraint that had carried it. And even those who had laughed before now clapped the hardest, their earlier expressions replaced with something closer to respect, or perhaps regret. Alexander Wolf did not join them at first, his hands remaining at his sides as he stared at the stage, his mind still catching up with what he had witnessed, because this was not just a performance, it was a correction, a quiet dismantling of assumptions he had built over years, and the realization settled heavily, not dramatic, not loud, but undeniable. He took a step forward without fully deciding to, drawn toward the stage as the applause continued, his presence finally shifting from control to response. And as Lillian slowly stood, the ovation did not fade, it intensified, as if the audience feared that if they stopped, the moment itself might disappear. She did not bow immediately, did not acknowledge the crowd in the way performers typically would. She simply turned slightly, her gaze sweeping across the room with a quiet awareness, not seeking approval, not searching for recognition, but simply observing, as if she had seen all of this before in another time, another life, and the weight of that unspoken history lingered in the way she carried herself. Alexander reached the edge of the stage and paused, the distance between them no longer measured in feet, but in understanding, and for the first time, there was no performance in his expression, no carefully constructed confidence, only a clarity that came from being confronted with something he could not dismiss. The applause continued around him, but in that moment, it felt distant, secondary to the realization unfolding in front of him. And when Lillian finally inclined her head slightly, a simple acknowledgement rather than a show of triumph, the gesture carried more weight than any grand bow could have. She stepped away from the piano without hesitation, without lingering, as if the instrument had served its purpose and required no further attention, and the crowd parted subtly as she moved toward the wings, their eyes following her not out of curiosity anymore, but out of respect, the kind that cannot be demanded, only earned. Behind her, the stage remained exactly as it had been, the grand piano still gleaming under the lights. But the meaning of it had changed, because now it was no longer a platform for status, but a reminder of what had just occurred, and Alexander Wolf stood in its shadow, finally understanding that the moment he thought he controlled had never truly been his at all.